But first, we're going to get into the Daniel Andrews rare moment of actual apology of a sorts today. And this relates to the parole bid by serial killer Paul Denyer and the toll it's taken on the victims and families.
The process has not been anywhere near where it should be in terms of support and engagement and just dealing with the trauma of this at a very human level. We will take care of that issue. More broadly though, we don't want a situation where people can be applying again and again and again when there's really no realistic likelihood that they would be granted parole.
Now, Paul Denyer was the man who savagely murdered Elizabeth Stevens, Debbie Freem and Natalie Russell in 1993, for which he was handed 3 life sentences. But later it was reduced to a non-parole period of 30 years on appeal. For some weeks, the opposition and MPs like David Limbrick, who was the boyfriend of one of the young women killed at the time, well, they've been urging the Premier to pass a bill to keep Denyer in prison for life, and I mean really for life. To date, the Premier has refused to support the bill, as well as refusing to meet with the families of the murdered women. But in that back down of sorts you just saw there now, I think he's picked up just how much community anger is in Victoria over his inaction. Now, of course, he's talking about parole reform rather than actually acknowledge inaction in this issue and lacking in support of the government's bill. As I said, he's pushed it all back to the parole board. The same parole board, I might add, just over a month ago, he said he had full faith in.
Particularly in the case of those who've been sentenced for life for murder or multiple murders, though that cohort that we're talking about, I think we can sensibly further limit the options that they have. That's not to be applying to the parole board every 5 minutes.
Apologies, that's not the right grab, but he certainly said he had faith in them a month or so ago when they kept Denyer back in jail. Joining me now, Victorian Shadow Minister for Police and Corrections, Brad Batten. Brad, welcome. Why, if he's now saying things are crook with parole and the system needs reforming, A, it's different than what he said a month ago, but why doesn't he just back your legislation to keep Denyer in prison for life?
Good evening, Peter. I think the simple answer is, and I think the example is exactly right now, this man's more about spin than he is actually having positive outcomes or engaging with people, particularly those families. The backflip that he's attempting to do right at the moment, you'll notice that there's no detail, there's nothing within that legislation, there's no time frame, there's been no negotiation or discussions with the family about this legislation, and that was up until last night. So the government is now just doing this as a knee-jerk reaction to try and backpedal, because as you said, there's a lot of anger out there. And we've said, because it's going to take a couple of years to get in place, that'll give Paul Denyer opportunities again to put these families through the torture that he has in the past by applying for parole. They have to go through victim impact statements. These are families that have to go through this and live those horrific circumstances from 30 years ago every time it goes back into the parole board.
And it's not like when this legislation for other individuals has been put to the Parliament, the Hoddle Street killer, of course, the Russell Street bomber, they all have a bill that keeps them in prison, supported in many occasions by the Labor Party. Why not do the right thing in relation to Denyer?
When you say supported by the Labor Party, 2014 we introduced legislation, and that was with Edward O'Donoghue. And then in 2018, the government, with Daniel Andrews as Premier, introduced legislation to ensure that Craig Minogue could no longer get out of jail. So it's not just they've supported it, they've also moved these pieces of legislation because they understand how important it is to make sure these people do stay behind bars. Yes, we do have faith within the Adult Parole Board to do what they're supposed to do, keep people behind bars when they should. However, it's not always perfect, we understand that. But more importantly, every time these applications come up, we actually put more into the concern here of it's the families that have to keep reliving it. And Daniel Andrews needs to acknowledge that now. He hasn't met with the families. He hasn't had discussions with them. And as I understand, the Attorney-General has contacted him yesterday, but still hadn't gone through the processes, which makes me think, again, that Daniel Andrews has put this legislation as an idea today rather than actually having it programmed or a process in place to ensure that the policy was ready to go so people can understand what it's all about.
When I spoke to David Limbrick about this, and of course he has the personal history of being connected to one of the victims all those years ago, firstly, Denyer has written to him which I find extraordinary, and he's written to others connected with the murdered women. But why on earth has Daniel Andrews refused to meet with these families?
I have to say that it'd be a great question for Daniel Andrews on why he wouldn't meet with these families. It doesn't make sense. We're not talking people that are antagonising. They haven't been out in the media for 30 years trying to create a big story for themselves. They genuinely actually want to get this over and done with and move away from it. And as you said, these are people that have been written to by Paul Denyer, and including David Limbrick, who was recently. And maybe that's also something we need to address. How are people behind bars writing to victims and victims' families about the circumstances of their release, of what they think they should have freedom? And Daniel Andrews to say now that he's going to change the legislation, so if they haven't done rehabilitation, or if they have done rehabilitation, they can apply for parole. If they haven't, they can't. What does this say now for the previous two with Knight and Minogue? If they've done programs, can they now apply for parole? How are these changes going to impact on every application that goes forward with the murderers that are in there? And does it open up the door for others to apply who we've already ruled out? These are the questions the government can't answer because, as I've said, this was more about a media release today because they know this bill is going to be debated tomorrow.
And I just don't think that there is any support in the community for people who commit mass murder to have the option of parole. I mean, life in this case should mean life. I've got you, and I'm going to ask you a question about something that really blew up today in Victoria in the Parliament, though, before we go. Cindy McLeish, she's your Shadow Minister for Women, Liberal Shadow Minister for Women. She claimed that Andrews called her a half-wit grub in the Parliament today. He makes an apology, he withdraws. I think I have that on tape. Let's have a look.
Speaker, I believe that the Premier called me a half-wit grub. I find that an absolutely offensive, and it's a shame on him, and I ask him to withdraw.
Order. The Premier to withdraw. The Premier to withdraw. Order. Order.
In deference to you, Speaker, I withdraw.
Thank you.
I think he owes this House and the Victorian people an apology to the member for Eildon. You apologise. That is a disgraceful comment.
Now, in relation to parliamentary slurs, half-wit grub is probably not the worst I've ever heard, but what McLeish then says later on in the media, I think, is the most telling, and I think I've got that for people at home. Have a listen.
And he has shown that this is a continued pattern of behaviour. Over the years, I recall when he made terrible comments about my friend and former colleague Donna Bauer when she had bowel cancer and said it won't be long before she is shitting in a plastic bag. He clearly hasn't learnt at all, and he needs to apologise.
It's those comments in relation to the bowel cancer MP that I want to mention here, Brad, because they've long been rumoured. That's the first time I've heard them publicly uttered there in the media. And that's the form of Daniel Andrews, isn't it? That's what people hear in and around the parliamentary building that doesn't often make it into the public domain. But Cindy McLeish today has put it right out there.
Yeah, and look, it took a lot of strength for Cindy to go out and say that. I think it's really important that we do highlight the fact that this is actually the behaviour, an ongoing behaviour of this man. There was more than rumours. It was people from his own party that were coming out and talking about the comments about Donna Bauer then. The other thing too, Peter, is tomorrow is Bowel Cancer Recognition Day. So people have to understand it's a big day tomorrow for people who have bowel cancer to raise awareness around it. This is not a way to raise awareness about it, but Daniel Andrews could use tomorrow to come out and apologise to Donna and apologise to Cindy and stop being just the arrogant, pig-headed man he is whenever he's treating women, particularly the women on our side of Parliament. We need to see that stop. We've got to make sure that we protect our own, but also it's an opportunity for us tomorrow to talk about something really important in the community.
All right, leave it there. Thank you, Brad Batten.